Hello, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge. And we hold all of the birth skills that hundreds of mothers and fathers developed in the early 1970s and have now been used by tens of thousands of families around the world, and also a concept that those mothers and fathers developed, which was that it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. So I've decided after COVID came out in our societies and countries and our communities that I needed to be more public again after many years working behind the scenes with our trust, because this concept that we should have a skilled birthing population was actually, we had a missed opportunity where we could have put this in place in the 70s. And unfortunately, there were very, very vocal people who actually dismissed the concept that we needed skills as women. We often will read a sentence that says, cows and cats aren't taught to birth, women don't need to birth, birth is instinctual, women know how to birth, women have given birth throughout time, and we just know how to birth. And that's always been curious to me since the 70s when I got involved. I had my first child in 1970. I didn't have an experience where I felt that I instinctively knew what I should be doing or what I should be doing. Yes, I was in the hospital with an evidence-based practice at that time, where we had lots of assessments and monitoring procedures that are different than the ones you experience. But apart from all those assessments, the monitoring and procedures, I was the one who was doing this activity, and I didn't have a clue. My husband and I had gone to Lamaze classes, and we had learned some simple breathing and relaxation skills. I couldn't even put a lot of those in place. They didn't adjust, they didn't adapt, they weren't sustainable. I didn't know exactly when to use what. And I can't say that I felt that I had had a bad or a good experience. I just got through it. And that's what most of the people in my generation felt. We got through it. If we didn't have a tragedy, we felt lucky. If we had a tragedy, it was sad. But even back then, there was very little birth control. So we had more children. And when the natural birth movement started to become very vocal in the late 70s and the 80s and became global, that movement definitely was a movement that at that time, and still is by and large, an anti-medical movement. And we can say that that people in the medical maternity field are anti-natural childbirth. Don't know. What I know is that the very vocal people in the natural birth movement were bringing forth concepts and ideas in childbirth that hopefully were going to lead to more natural births. Back then in the early 70s, when I was developing these skills with hundreds of families, we felt that the conversation that was being led by the natural childbirth movement was actually full of so many inaccuracies and assumptions and misdirections and misinformation that it was really, really hard to understand, or to understand how to put the concept that childbirth and pregnancy are normal life events. How do you put that into practice in any society so that we have healthy mothers and babies at the end, or that women don't suffer in childbirth if they're laboring because they don't know how to deal with the natural and normal occurring pain of labor contractions? We didn't know how to put the concepts that were being advocated actually into practice. Of course, there are people who did know how to do that. They believed that choosing a home birth was going to give them a great birth. And yet, even in the 70s, women who chose home births, 30 to 60% of them ended up transferring to hospitals. We were told by the natural birth movement that the medical profession was robbing our capacity to birth because of the assessments, monitoring procedures. And that was based on an inaccurate belief that we had all experienced childbirth when we lived prior to the medical model. And that's not accurate across the board in diverse cultures. Very few people see birth, and if they do, they just see a few of them. And if that few births women suffered and felt overwhelmed, then that's what they saw. Even in a family today, if you have children being at home births, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. If the woman is working very well and coping very well, that's what the child sees. If the woman is stressed and feeling out of control, that's what the child sees. And there's no guarantee that what that child sees when they grow up to have children will be the type of birth they have. So when we talk about things like instinct, we're talking about things that are extremely difficult to explain. Extremely difficult. Most of us have experienced instinct as a rapid physical movement, perhaps a ball being thrown at us, and we instinctively do that, right? We know that, but we know that lasts for a fraction of a second. And if we're laboring, then we can go on for hours or for days. So on Facebook pages now, you hear women saying, I'm 30 weeks pregnant or 32 weeks pregnant and I'm having prodromal labor. Well, they're not having prodromal labor. What they're doing is misunderstanding the toning that the uterus does, having Braxton Hicks contractions to actually labor. Braxton Hicks contractions aren't labor, and labor is very defined as something that is active, that ends with a birth, and is involved in a dilation of the cervix. The other aspect of instinct is, as I mentioned in the description, is birds instinctively build nests. And we often hear women say at the end of pregnancy, I'm nesting. I frantically want to clean, or I'm very tired. And that's their body doing something that is physiological. It's part of our body. Whether it's instinctive or not, it's a hard one to understand. Then when we're dealing with women in labor, for those of us who've had the privilege of being at lots and lots of births, we've watched a lot of women who are having very progressive labors. Their contractions are getting closer together. The contractions are getting stronger. The contractions are getting more intense, which is what a progressive labor is. And the woman doesn't like the sensations. So she instinctively moves into a position where the labor contractions back off. Has she responded appropriately to the needs of her baby to come down through and out? No, she hasn't. What she's done is to instinctively, which humans do, is to do something to avoid the pain or to decrease the sensations. So she's now moved into a position where the contractions are less intense, which she feels relief from. They're spaced further apart, and they're not as long. And she doesn't instinctively understand that her baby is giving her a message that the position she's more comfortable in now is not a position that's favorable for the efforts of her baby. So when we talk about instinct in birth, we have to understand that we can have positive instincts, or we can respond positively to what is happening to or around us or internally to us, or we can respond in a non-productive manner. And we can do that by choice, or we can call it instinct. So it's been a complicated word to use. And I give two examples in the description. A woman in a birth will say, I just instinctively knew what position to get into. And that might be true, as long as the position she got into forwarded the purpose of the efforts of her baby. And if it didn't, then she instinctively got into a position the baby didn't like. Or we can hear women say that during the birth, they were so overwhelmed. And that is saying, in some ways, I didn't have an instinct to know how to behave when I'm dealing with intense, natural, and normal labor pain contractions. But what's happened in this conversation about instinctive birth is that there has been an implication that those of us who don't get it somehow are failing our womanness or failing this part of our body. And that leads to the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and birth trauma that so many women since the 80s have felt. And this is one of the things that when I worked with the families in the early 70s who developed Birthing Better, we realized how women were beginning to talk to one another. There was this huge change from my generation, the 60s and 70s, to when I gave birth last in 1982, to what women were saying to each other. And there was no doubt that women who felt that they had birthed instinctively felt that they had had a more perfect birth, and that somehow other women weren't able to be in touch with that part of themselves, and vice versa. Women who felt that they weren't able to be in touch with themselves felt that they had failed some sort of womanness in themselves because they heard other women talk about how successful they were. And this is one of the qualities that women are not kind to one another about. And our trust would like to change that. And how would our trust like to change that? What we'd like to say is that all of us will birth better when we grow a skilled birthing population across the board for all of our births. And the way we try to explain this to people is that once your baby is born, you're going to do everything you can to be a skilled parent. You instinctively don't always know how to parent. Sometimes you have to actually learn skills, and sometimes it's trial and error. And when we have children, we have years and years and years and years to practice and refine and become more skilled. And we realize that a lot of parenting skills come from choice. In other words, we might have a bad day with our baby, and we just may feel absolutely over the top. We want to cry, we're angry, we're frustrated. Yet we know we can't act that out with our children, because when we do, that becomes problematic. And those of us who choose to not scream when we instinctively want to scream know that the instinct is to scream, but the skilled adult behavior is not to scream. And a lot of people don't really realize that when you're pregnant, particularly after 24 weeks, your baby is here now. And when you become skilled in pregnancy, and when you learn to prepare your body in pregnancy, and when you use skills to work through the activity you and your baby are doing so that your baby moves from inside to outside your body, then you will move into parenting to a child that's outside your body with infinitely more confidence, just as you birthed that child with more confidence because you used skills that you had learned in pregnancy. Now, do skills override instinct? No, skills enhance instinct. If we do not know how to reduce the 4 types of tension in our body consciously, then there's no way that we're going to suddenly understand them when we're in labor. If we don't understand that a non-laboring cesarean is still giving birth, and we don't know that we should have prepared our body anyway just to enjoy doing so and learn skills so that we could use them on the way to the hospital while being prepped and during surgery, it's because we're being told that a cesarean somehow is not a real birth. And that's not okay. The birth of each of our children is an important event in our life. It's life transforming forever. And we remember that birth. Having a family-centered cesarean is only that small part of your participation, and it is what they are doing for you and around you. What are you doing to have a family-centered cesarean? Are you and your partner learning skills, breathing and relaxation skills, to work through the activity of birthing your baby in a cesarean? Don't you think that adds and enhances to this concept of a family-centered cesarean? May not be instinctual, but it can be a choice to use skills to work through this activity. If you're laboring and you find that the contractions are not particularly painful, then most of us really, in some ways, just get on with our life. We don't do much about it. But when labor contractions become more painful, then we have a choice of how we respond to them. And that's where the message of instinctive birth is very cloudy, because there is no guarantee that if we lack skills, that we will instinctively respond to increased natural pain in labor in a proactive way that helps our baby open our body and come down through and out. In fact, the majority of women in labor who are experiencing pain that they're having difficulty coping with instinctively react to pain by pulling away from it. And when they pull away from it, then they can pull away from it, as I mentioned earlier, by getting into positions that lessen the pain but can prolong the labor, because the baby doesn't like that position. So we need to understand that when we couple skills to instinct, when we're experiencing labor and we're beginning to have a labor contraction and we can feel it coming on, we can then choose how to soften inside our body. We can choose what positions to get into that keep us open. We can choose how to adapt and adjust our breathing so that we cope and handle and work through and manage and deal with and stay on top of the rise of intensity of a labor contraction, the peaking of a labor contraction, the easing off of it, and then the reduction of pain and our need to let go of the energy of that last contraction. These are the things that we can do and should do consciously. And the only way that we can achieve that is by replacing the ideal of an instinctive birth that so many women fail to achieve with the achievable broad goal that 100% of pregnant women should become skilled in pregnancy and self-learned skills, and then use the skills to work through the activity of birthing their baby. We need to, as women, enhance each other and not set up oppositional models. We don't need oppositional models. Honestly, it's destructive to ourselves individually, because either we feel better than someone else or we feel we failed ourselves and we can't match up to our relative or our friend or someone we're listening to on social media. We have to stop this, and the way we stop it is very, very, very simple, which is to pass on the concept that when you're pregnant, it's normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Because let's put it this way, let's just take 1,000 women who are birthing, and 1,000 women are told, you'll know what to do, dear. Birth is a normal life event and you'll know what to do. How many women will actually cope well? We don't know. We assume that there's a percent of people that will. What percent of people? Can range from 1% to 20%, which leaves 80% of people not coping well. And if women aren't coping well in birth, then they feel that they're suffering. And if they're suffering, then they feel disconnected from the experience that they're having. On the other hand, if we take those 1,000 women and all of them are skilled, then they will use skills in their birth to one level or another. And they will come away from birth knowing that they have used those skills. So I need to go because there's somebody at the door. See you later.